Hello everybody, welcome to another video. Today is the 9th of March, and today we're covering the situation around the Orikhiv sector. Then we'll go to Krasnohorivka, Avdiivka, and we'll finish off by looking at the Zherebets River front. And then last thing we'll do is analyze this video released by the Russian MOD of an Iskander strike on a Ukrainian air defense convoy. That's really interesting. But let's begin by looking at what's going on around Robotyne, where, if you recall, the Ukrainians successfully counterattacked, what was it, like a week and a half ago, and they were able to reestablish their control over the fortifications to the south of the village. I'll mark that in blue over here. And so the Russian focus has become more pointed and focused at one particular area, and that's around this fortification system, because the Russians understand that by getting control of this area and the heights that go along with it, they would have a local domination over the village. They would be able to fire directly towards the Ukrainian positions within it. They'd be able to fire into the supply lines. And so the Russian forces, they have increased their artillery shelling of the Ukrainian groupings in this fortification system, and all the trenches are marked in the light green color. And this is being done by the 70th Motor Rifle Regiment of the 42nd Motor Rifle Division. In this video, you can see the heavy shelling. And then the Russian forces, as of yesterday, the 8th of March, they started launching new armored assaults towards the southwestern section of this fortification system. And this was really proven by footage released by the Ukrainian side. So I have some of that linked over here on my map. In this one video, you could see that there are 3 new BMP losses for the Russian side, BMP 1, 2s, and 3s, as they advanced along this particular tree line in the direction of the Ukrainian stronghold located further north. The Ukrainians, they spotted the Russian attack, and they were able to target the vehicles as they were advancing in no man's land with artillery and FPV drones. And then a bit further to the north, there was another Russian vector of attack, and this was likely a flanking maneuver to try to cut off the connection between the Ukrainian squads located within the trenches and within Robotyne. And so there was a smaller attack vector coming in from the west by one Russian BMP-3, and eventually it was abandoned by the Russian side, and then an FPV drone from the 128th Mountain Assault Brigade ended up hitting it directly and damaging it. And so now that confirms the involvement of the 128th Brigade in the fighting around Robotyne. We know that said unit has been operating on Robotyne's northwestern flank and generally around the Orikhiv sector, but likely because of Russia's increased pressure starting around February 17th, further elements of this unit have been moved further south to help beef up the defense of the village of Robotyne. And it's not just the 128th that's being sent in as additional reinforcements. You also have certain elements of the 65th Mechanized Brigade, which is already defending in this section, but additional squads, dozens more men are being moved in from this unit. You also have elements of the 118th Brigade that are being moved in, and the 82nd Air Assault Brigade. And before we move on to the Donetsk front, there's one additional video released by the 1st Battalion of the 14th National Guard Brigade, a Ukrainian unit, where they shell and their drones drop grenades onto Russian infantry as they attack some of the Ukrainian defenses that were built up by the Russians in preparation for the summer counteroffensive past the Zherebets line. So the Zherebets line, if you look at the map, I have it marked in red over here. The Russian forces have now solidified 100% control of all the territory to the south of it, and they have since branched out and are attacking towards the Ukrainian outposts that are nearby. And so one of the largest Ukrainian defensive nodes, which is, again, as I said, built by the Russians, is located just to the northwest, marked in this blue rectangle over here, because it is situated around some trenches, and a lot of tree lines are also based in that area, and it is pretty close to Verbove, and so the Russian forces are trying to relieve all of the pressure possible in that region in order to really create the proper conditions for chipping away at Ukraine's presence on the Orikhiv sector. And so their infantry did launch attacks. In this case, they were not able to advance past this one particular tree line due to the Ukrainian resistance, but it does show us where the momentum is shifting, and the Russian forces have been able to advance several hundred meters past the Zherebets line. The situation around Krasnohorivka is very interesting because Russian sources such as Rybar are claiming that the Russian forces still maintain control over the southern section of the residential areas. And so, just looking at the map to see what that entails, it would mean the Russian forces have generally control over this region. And Rybar has recently claimed, as of I believe the 7th of March, that the Russian forces have actually expanded control in some of these residential areas, and they are steadfast in that belief. But so far, after several days of waiting, I have not seen any visual evidence to confirm a Russian advance, and the Ukrainian sources have not mentioned any such Russian attack on their end. The Ukrainian sources have been relatively firm in saying that the Russian forces around the end of February did launch attacks along this particular road, but that following the arrival of reinforcements, they were able to kick them out of the residential sections, with now the main Russian forward defense or forward operating node being around the Trudovska mine located further south. And so we really do have to wait and see to check the veracity of these claims. But what we do know for sure is that the Russian forces have increased their bombing of Krasnohorivka. Really, we're seeing combined use of multiple different types of firepower. We're seeing the use of fab bombs, now a lot of fab 1500s in particular, and that makes a lot of sense because Krasnohorivka is filled with Ukrainian strong points such as apartment buildings, industrial facilities, train stations that are all heavily fortified and built up to withstand such attacks. And using such a large explosive yield really undermines that Ukrainian defense. And now the Russian forces are ramping up this bombing campaign as reinforcements are being moved into Krasnohorivka. So I do believe that the Russians sort of timed this. They timed it for the arrival of those really reinforcements being moved into the train station area, which is located around here in the center. And then that's when they ramped up this bombing campaign. But it's not just bombs, it's also a lot of artillery shelling, some of it using guided projectiles like the Krasnopols. You have some drones being used, ATGMs, and some of the fab strikes were filmed by the Russian side. In this one, there was a strike on a refractory material plant, and in other cases, there are strikes specifically on Ukrainian infantry or drone operating crews. And just as a quick reminder, the reinforcements moved in by the Ukrainians to the sector include elements of the 80th Air Assault Brigade, especially the 2nd Battalion of that unit, and actually the Azov Brigade that they have moved in some of their elements, not just to Avdiivka, but also to defend around Krasnohorivka. The Avdiivka front for over a week now has largely been defined by Ukrainian attempts at counterattacking in order to give their engineering sapper units enough time to dig up additional defenses around Semenivka and further on the rear. And in recent days, we've seen the Ukrainian attempts at holding the line reversed, especially around Tonenke. So around Tonenke, we could say that by the end of February, early March, the Ukrainian forces were able to reestablish control in the northwestern sections of that village, especially around this portion over here. And in the subsequent days, the Ukrainians expanded their operations to the southern section of Tonenke around this region over here. And the Russian forces, what they did is they solidified control over Orlivka, especially around the southern section. The western section of Orlivka is to be determined. We still don't have accurate information about the status of that section. But you can see that the Russian forces did have a vector of attack from the southern road of Orlivka, and they utilized supply lines that branch out from it in order to send infantry squads on, lightly armored vehicles, sometimes ATVs, and they advanced southwards and they created a new attacking vector. And that was first verified on the 4th of March by this geolocated footage of the 53rd Mechanized Brigade, a Ukrainian unit operating in this region, with their FPV drone hitting the Russian forces on an ATV to the south of Orlivka. And so starting around March 4th, then going into 5th and 6th, the Russian forces developed this new salient to the south of Orlivka that looks something like this. By the 6th to the 9th of March, which is now where we're at today, the 9th of March, the Russian forces were able to actually penetrate into Tonenke along this dirt road over here and get control over certain sections of the central parts of this village, including some residential buildings. And by virtue of doing so, it appears that they've been able to split the road that was acting as a connective route for the Ukrainian garrisons in the southern and the northern sections of that village. And so now the big question, which I don't have an answer to, is what is the status of the Ukrainian groupings in this sector? Do they even exist? Are there even Ukrainian squads left in the section? If not, then it means that the Russian forces over the coming days will be able to solidify control over it and move the front lines further west. If there are still Ukrainian infantry, individual forces, or just squads operating here, then it is extremely difficult for them to leave at this point, as the Russian forces are enveloping them on all sides, and their escape route is through a gray zone, which would be extremely difficult to do at this point in time. So, really, it is dependent on that, whether they even exist. But regardless, the Russian forces have been confirmed to get control over this warehouse area. This was verified based off of video released by the Ukrainians today, showing their drones dropping a charge onto 6 Russian infantrymen that were operating around the ruins of the warehouse. So that verifies that the Russian forces did have a powerful northern spearhead that cut into the center of Tonenke and made it difficult for the Ukrainians to continue holding on to their forward positions. And as a result, now the only Ukrainian positions we could say they have left in Tonenke are in the northwest. And even these positions are in question due to the Russian forces holding a attack node just to the north along this vector of attack just to the north. Again, they're also putting pressure directly from the east. And so there is a big question to be had about whether the Ukrainians are beginning to withdraw from the section or have already. Because as you can see, their withdrawal route is through only one road, this one road leading into Umanske, and the rest of it is just open fields. And the area where Ukraine does have a solid control is pretty narrow. Most of it is a gray zone, and it is within the range of various types of Russian shorter range types of firepower. And so it is a dangerous situation for the several Ukrainian infantry squads that are still located in that direction. But the reason why they're even holding on, as I said, is to buy time for the rest of the defensive works that Ukraine is constructing in this region. There are also defenses being constructed by Ukraine around Umanske. They want to try to maintain control of Umanske because Umanske does have roads branching out into other parts of the front line that I'm marking on the map over here. And so they want to just protect that for the village from becoming the center of a new battle. Also, in order to protect Semenivka's southern flank, and that's part of why the Ukrainians have resisted so much in Berdichi. They don't want to give up control of the hills that are located around Berdichi. And of course, it's all relative because, in relative terms, Avdiivka overlooks Berdichi, but then at the same time, Berdichi overlooks Semenivka. So the Ukrainians are trying to hold on to whatever hills or whatever heights they have at their disposal. They also don't want to give up the flanks and the routes leading into Semenivka. And so, for the most part, the Ukrainians do have control over Berdichi. I've not seen any evidence to the contrary, although today I did see reports from Russian side that they have been able to increase attacks on the central part of the village from an attack starting in Stepove. That still has to be verified based off of video footage. But again, in Ukraine's quest to hold on to Berdichi, they have, since my last video, lost an additional Abrams tank, and there's a video or a still of a video that was released by the Ghoul drone unit of the Russian side, marked at this crossroads into the center of Berdichi, which shows 3 damaged Bradleys. So those may or may not be already recorded losses. I believe that 3 of the 4 Bradley losses that have already been verified from Berdichi were not located in this particular area. So it appears that perhaps 2 of them may be new losses, and they were likely destroyed by Russian FPV drones, or they were abandoned and then targeted by those FPV drones. But either way, you understand why this is happening. It's an inevitability on the battlefield in an area that is very close to the line of contact, located on a valley. As I said, in comparison to Avdiivka, it's located on relatively low elevation and exposed to numerous types of Russian firepower. And lastly, we're looking at the Zherebets River front. As you can see, the front line here has been pretty static. Really, every few weeks, the Russian forces launch a attack over here involving several armored vehicles, usually organized into a column. Almost always, the Ukrainians are able to disperse these attacks, and released footage of several Russian material losses. And so now that a lot of that has built up in this region just to the east of the Zherebets River. And so the Russian forces have gradually been trying to push closer and closer to the river itself and towards the two villages the Ukrainians are using as forward operating points, and that includes Terny and Yampolivka. Now they're about 2 kilometers to the east of these villages based off of new geolocations from the 12th National Guard Brigade Azov, where their FPVs hit 3 Russian vehicles, and in one of them it's a BMP where you have the Russian forces, 5 infantrymen actually stationed on top, and so they were hit directly. And so this assault by the Russian forces again was repelled, but they were able to advance a couple meters. When you measure it on the map, it amounts to about 600 700 meter advance in total along this tree line. This has been a tree line that's been a very popular choice for Russian vehicles as they try to advance westwards. And so now that is the new line of contact. Theory is that the Russian forces every now and then try to launch attacks over here in order to divert Ukrainian attention, generally in this Luhansk, Donetsk sector, away from certain parts of the front line in favor of this area over here. And then eventually they reduce their attacks over here and shift focus somewhere else. But either way, the Russian forces are very, very slowly chipping away, while the Ukrainian garrison is still able to take out Russian equipment. And lastly, the news that is making all the rounds today comes from released footage from the Russian MOD showing the destruction of an entire surface-to-air missile convoy near the town of Zherebets. We'll zoom out for a second so you get a reference of where it is located. So near that village, if you use the measuring stick, we'll see that it is about 50 kilometers away from the front line. At its closest extent, it is around 52 kilometers away. So as you can see, it is pretty close to the large Ukrainian logistical hub of Pokrovsk in Donetsk Oblast. And this comes after about 3 to 4 weeks of the Russians just pumping out a bunch of footage showing the destruction of air defense systems that have been utilized by the Ukrainians. And I could just go through a list of some of them if you're interested. There's 3 P-18 radars that were targeted, 1 NASAMS launcher, 2 Buk M1 missile systems, an ST-68U radar. And in this most recent video, there is some dispute as to what was actually targeted. In the video released by the Russians, which I'll show you guys, the claim that there were 3 S-300 missile systems that were destroyed, and then 3 additional sort of auxiliary vehicles that were also targeted in that convoy. So in this video I have over here, you can see that the MOD released how the Iskander, it hits the stationary convoy with the, as I said before, the short-range ballistic missile. And as you can see, it appears that there is some sort of secondary explosion that has occurred from some of the fuel held in one of the vehicles. And either way, it was a very accurate strike on those 6 systems that were located along this one road. But then the Russians released this aftermath footage showing the results of the strike. And a lot of people, and I can't say this for sure because I'm not an expert in the field, they were claiming that these are not actually S-300 launchers. So I'll show you guys the video here on myself. And also I have this linked on my map. But what some people are claiming is that what is claimed to be one of the S-300 launchers is actually a German Mancat 1 truck, which is actually used to transport the Patriot launchers. And then they claim that the 2 other S-300 systems that were claimed on the video by the Russian side are actually 2 German M901 launchers from the MIM-104 PAC-2 Patriot air defense systems. If the identification of these 2 Patriot launchers is correct, and I've seen a lot of pro-Ukrainian accounts actually admitting it as well, so there is some dispute, which is why I'm not going to say it with 100% certainty, but you should be, I would have to explain that the general consensus for most people online is that those were actually Patriot systems, but it is just interesting to see that the Russian forces themselves identified it as S-300 systems. So if that's actually the case, and it appears the Russians may have actually made a mistake, but in any case, that would be the first visually confirmed loss of those Patriot launchers. It is reported, and I don't know this with 100% certainty either, but it is claimed that there are about 5 Patriot systems, so it would be 2 out of 5 that were destroyed in the strike. And that is really significant in a short-term level, because what we see here is that the Ukrainians, they had taken this risk by moving the air defense systems, really regardless of what system it was, but if it was Patriot systems, and even more so, of moving Western provided weaponry closer and closer to the front line, in this case around 50 kilometers away from the front line. And the reason why they did it is pretty clear. The Russian forces have recently started using a lot of Fab 500, Fab 1500 glide bombs, which have increased the amount of firepower they could utilize on the front line, and they don't even have to approach the front line that much because the glide bombs are able to glide away from like 20, 30 kilometers away from the front line and hit their targets relatively accurately in the same radius. And so the Ukrainians, they tried to get the Patriots closer and closer and closer, in many cases, not just around Donetsk, but also around Kherson, in order to get within the range of the Su-34s that are dropping these Fab bombs. And they had some success in that regard, first around Kherson, and then when the Russian forces shifted their focus towards the Avdiivka offensive and supporting it with firepower, they also moved the Patriots in that direction, most likely, and were also involved in the downing of some of those Su-34 jets, and otherwise some other Russian jets that were flying in the skies in this area, launching cruise and ballistic missiles were also launched generally along this entire sector in recent weeks. And so the Patriots definitely played a role in reducing the extent to which the Russian forces had a localized air superiority in this section of the front line, targeting, of course, some of the missiles that were launched, but also the aircraft themselves. And more generally, the Patriot systems have been deployed at major cities around Ukraine on the rear, like Kiev. Some of them may have been moved to the front line recently, but there are still some systems, at least it is imagined, from either the Americans or the Germans that are stationed around major cities like Kiev in order to stop the extent to which damage is incurred by the facilities in the city. And so that is also to withstand attacks from airstrikes and from drone attacks. And so now with the potential loss of 2 out of the 5, which is imagined to be the number of these actual systems, that would be a massive degradation to the components of the Patriot air defense systems that Ukraine has in Ukraine. And now they're going to have to be much more wise about how they utilize the remaining ones that they have at their disposal, whether they put them at the front line or on the rear. Either way, there will be a loss for the Ukrainians. If they put it on the front line, then they will be exposed on the rear to more Russian airstrikes on Ukrainian military bases, on their energy infrastructure if the Russians so choose. So we could see a ramping up of that. Or if the Ukrainians decide to revert back to the original purpose of the Patriots being deployed, because originally most of them were deployed around the cities on the rear. If the Ukrainians revert back to that, then the Russian forces will have achieved more localized air superiority in some of these battles, especially in areas like Avdiivka, where we'll probably see the dropping of additional Fab 1500 bombs that are now being deployed en masse by the Russian side near the front line. And as a further takeaway, as we've seen with a lot of these videos of the Russians targeting Ukrainian air defense systems, and especially with this one, we're seeing an improvement in Russia's ISR capabilities to detect a lot of the Ukrainian systems and direct fire towards them. And it is pretty interesting that the drones that were used in this video to record the convoy itself and to guide the missile systems as they were reaching their entire destination, they were not seen by the Ukrainians. They were not detected by the Ukrainian systems nearby. It is pretty interesting to see that. And the potential costs of such a strike are really massive for Ukraine, because an Iskander missile costs around $3 million. And when you look at an entire Patriot battery, it costs around $1.1 billion. And in this case, if we're talking about 2 launchers and potentially the radar system attached to it, again, I'm not an expert at identifying the wrecks, and so I can only look at what other expert opinions are saying, and so I can't say anything with 100% certainty. But if it were to be the case that you had 2 launchers, you had a truck associated with it, all these support vehicles, and that would be perhaps about half of a Patriot battery. And so that in terms of costs, that could rise into the hundreds of millions of dollars in actual damages. So we're really going to have to wait and see what comes out with additional information in that regard. But thank you all for watching, and I'll see you guys in the next video. Goodbye.